boys who are aged 20 and 12. I'd like to now go ahead and introduce our panelists for today. First up, I would like Anisha to please go ahead and introduce herself.
Hello, I wanted to say thank you to Indiaspora for organizing this event. Thank you, Maura, for being our moderator. It's wonderful to be here and to be with all of you. My name is Anisha Abraham. I'm a pediatrician and teen health specialist. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C. I was born and brought up in the United States, but actually have lived and worked with my family in Asia and in Europe. And I am author of a book called Raising Global Teens. And I know we'll be talking a lot tonight about young people and certainly their experiences. But for me, one of my true passions is working with young people that have had that experience of more than one culture in their daily life.
Thanks, Anisha. Ekta, eager to hear from you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you again for having me as well. My name's Ekta. I'm, was born in Firozpur, brought up here in the States in California and Tennessee, and I'm also based in Los Angeles. I'm a mom of two really young kids. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and my specialties are working with, BIPOC and LGBTQIA folks. And thankfully, I'm honored that a lot of my clients are South Asian individuals. And I work in a college setting as well. So I provide therapy at USC to graduate and undergraduate students. And I also have a small private practice. And I'm the director for DEIB for the Department of Psychiatry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekta. Aruna, how about you?
Hi, everyone. My name's Aruna, pronouns she and hers. I was born and raised in Bengaluru, and I've been a mental health advocate for about 2 decades. Founded a mental health program called Samhaj, which was the first in the United States to focus on South Asians affected by mental illness and their family members. I've started Desi Rainbow as a community resource out of my own experience, my own lived experience parenting a queer and transgender child without a lot of community support. I'm a proud mother to Leo. I'm an auntie to many Desi LGBTQ folks of all ages. I build a lot of chosen family and community through my work, and I live in New Jersey with my husband, Krishna.
And finally, Akshata, it's great to have you with us. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Another fellow Bangalorean here. I was also born and raised in Bengaluru. Total science geek. I have 2 masters of science degrees in biochemistry and nutrition. So children's media was a bit of an unexpected thing to happen to me. But Little Pataka, my business, is my 3rd successful business launch. I have a wellness center in Vermont where my husband's a chiropractor and we're both nutritionists. So we run that together. And before I launched Little Pataka, I also had a vegan skincare business line that I closed down when the pandemic hit. It was just a lot of personal health issues as well as the uncertainties of the pandemic that brought about that decision. But when I was home with my daughter, who was 2 years old at that time, and home from daycare, being with her when her vocabulary was exploding led to the formation and foundation of Little Pataka. And so now what started as a way to bring Indian language and cultural resources and making them accessible to everyone, we have now shifted instead to look at books, games, and toys for young children about, early elementary age and younger. And our products focus on our shared experiences in an effort to build confidence and nurture empathy, which are both leadership qualities, we think. I live in Vermont with my husband, Greg, and my daughter, Ava, who's now 6 years old, and the reason Little Pataka exists, and my 11-month-old boy, Aaron.
Well, thank you to everyone joining us today. All of our panelists are joining us in community, and we are not here to provide professional medical advice. That being said, we do have some doctors on this virtual Zoom event, and they are on call. So if one of them needs to jump off, please excuse them. Just look at this group of accomplished professionals. It's a joyful moment for us to be sitting where we are and in community with other members of Indiaspora. So I'm really grateful for that. And now I'm going to divulge a little secret. I have actually never read a parenting book. So in true Desi style, I'm coming to this virtual event to get some Sasta, Sundar or Tikau advice and to learn about the joys and challenges of being a part of a Desi family. So let's start with setting up some context. In Indiaspora's recently commissioned study of the diaspora, we learned that there are 5.1 million Indian Americans living in the US, of which we're estimating 1.25 million are children under the age of 18. Most recently, with the rise of Kamala Harris and national politics, these million-plus kids are in a situation where their Indianness is being scrutinized. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there are so many Desi influencers and entertainers breaking through. So what does all of this mean for family networks? How do we prepare young people to navigate their identity in a changing world? And how do we prepare ourselves as their first known ancestors in this country that we adopted? So in that spirit, my first question is to Anisha. Anisha, you're a pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. And when a parent shows up to your practice or is admitted to the hospital, the first and most important line to be filled in on any intake forms is signature of parent. However, the forms don't define who or what is a parent. So in your opinion, what is a parent?
Well, we could certainly spend the entire evening talking about what a parent is. But I do think that obviously a parent is someone, or a caregiver is someone that would want to make sure that their child is healthy and getting the medical services that they need. But I would probably add more than that, that more than ever, parents are someone that's going to provide the nurture and support that those children or teenagers need. And certainly in my practice, we see that young people are changing so much. They're coming to terms with their physical identity, and we see issues related to body image and so on. They're coming to terms with their gender and sexual identity, and they're coming to terms with their cultural identity. And so part of being a parent is supporting young people and getting through that and making sure that they feel fully confident as they go into adulthood. And I would add that probably one of the most important markers of success is actually not doing well, just getting into the top college or having a top resume, but it's that ability to get back up on your feet after you've had a challenge. And I call that concept having bounce. And a really important part of parenting, and it's not easy, and I say that as a parent of 2 teen boys myself, is allowing kids sometimes to experience trouble and to experience problems and to get back up, and providing them that ability to problem solve and certainly to develop resilience. So that is my very short answer to what I think are some of the elements of being a parent and being a parent right now to in a modern age. But I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this as we go on.
Yeah, you're right. Listen, I just love this idea of having bounce, and I've made a note. We're going to come back to that later in the discussion. Ekta, you're a clinical psychologist with a roster of clients that spans teens and college students, and you also hold a faculty position at USC. I'm actually sitting in the shadow of a USC building in downtown Los Angeles right now. And the term parenting, most of us take to mean the act of raising a child, but we know that it's way more complex than that. How do you define parenting?
And I come to your question with a lot of humility as a new parent. So I know there's a lot of wisdom on this panel and in this room in general, but, I really think about it as the dynamic ways that we nurture a child to become compassionate, curious, and open, and that they have the tools to pursue their passions and purpose in this world. And I think a key part of that is the dynamic part of it, that it's ever changing depending on the child you have, their temperament, their personality, but also, over the course of their life, they need a different parent. Throughout our parenting has to change. And it's more about them rather than what maybe we want for them. Of course, we instill values in them, but it's helping them have the tools to figure this out. And I appreciate, what Anisha said as well around bounds, because I think about that as we're hoping to give them the tools to be able to, take on the world with resilience and care and compassion. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, that's all very profound. And Aruna, that actually brings us very beautifully to sort of get your opinion on your work at Desi Rainbow, where you uplift and support queer individuals and their families. The stereotype we most often see reinforced in a Desi family, where elders will all, want their kids to settle down and have a normal life. But this concept of of normal, Aruna, what is normal?
Yeah, that's absolutely the most important question to ask here, Mara. So, normalcy, fitting in, this aspirations that parents have for their children are really like kind of magnified, I think, in immigrant communities because we are always so conscious of what we have left behind, perhaps economically, socially. So, we really aspire for our children to do better than us. And so, our idea of normalcy is, our children, just like the next generation, is going to do much better than we did as immigrants. And then when it comes to something like divergence in sexuality or in gender identity, that deeply threatens our ideas of what we consider normal, right? It's literally breaking the norms by saying that essentially, attraction can be between people who are not just cisgender men and women, or that gender assigned at birth is not immutable. So, when we have children who are this kind of embodiment of all our hopes and aspirations, and then they kind of, break out of this norm, it can be devastating for us. And that's certainly the case for me. So when my child came out, I do think it's coming out, though he was 5 years old. He told me that he was a boy, and I was very indulgent. I decided, okay, my little girl is a tomboy, and I decided to just let him run with it. I was like, he's being imaginative, he's being a tomboy. He even picked a boy's name to use. But when he got older, I got very defensive because I had to actually defend him to family and to community. And then I started, sort of doing things like saying, "Oh, don't you look pretty in this dress?" and trying to get him to like behave more normally, or what I considered normal at that time. And so I didn't really like believe what he was trying to tell me at that point. And then when he told me he was gay in high school, at that point I did believe him, but I was devastated. I thought what I felt mostly was grief or fear. There was really no sense of feeling like, perhaps my child is actually finding out who he is. Having a lesbian child was so outside the norm for me that I didn't know that there was any reaction to it except grief and sorrow and fear. So now it's almost a decade later. So my child is now actually just turned 27. And I wish I could say that all parents, Desi parents' reactions to their kid coming out are very different. And unfortunately, I cannot say that. And that's the reason that Desi Rainbow exists and continues to do this really important work in the community. Because the reaction remains the same: grief, sorrow, fear. That's really like what I see over and over again from families. And there are also parents who are disgusted, angry, and actively cause harm to their children because of this reaction, because of believing that their children are not normal. So it's the root cause of all these reactions, right? These reactions to your child's LGBTQI identity is because our worldview doesn't allow queer and trans people to be part of the normal spectrum of identity in the world. And it's only when we start questioning this, and then we start realizing that this is not new or contemporary or something that happened because we immigrated to the West, but people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual have always existed in all cultures across the world. And that's when essentially our sense of normalcy begins to develop in a different way. And I'd like to actually end by saying, offering an alternative view of normalcy, what it could look like. So when our children tell us who they are, we express joy, we celebrate their existence, their ability to express themselves, their willingness to trust us with their truth and to live authentically. And normalcy is also not assuming that your child is cisgender and straight, because essentially your child could be any of the other identities, the million identities out there in the sun. So that's a little bit of what my idea of normal, and I think what the world's idea of normal should be.
Wow, that was really wonderful to hear you express all of that. That's very complex information, but you really expressed it in a way that made sense and made it very accessible for all of us to understand. And Akshada, talking about accessibility, there is a belief that children should be protected from exposure to certain information because they're too young for it. But in your work, you're expanding the spectrum of role models that every young child is exposed to. Can you tell us a little bit more about the thinking behind Little Pataka? And I know you set it up already when you were introducing yourself. But what's your thinking around the products, the stories, the toys that you're launching?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the part that got me really involved and thinking about it was when I found a research article that said social biases set in by the time kids are 5 years of age. And that really just blew me away, because if you think about kids who are 5 years old, before they've entered kindergarten, right? This group as such is one that we either, if we ask them their opinions, we don't take it seriously, but first we may not even ask them for their opinions. They're a very protected group in most cases, in terms of exposure of what they, see around them. It's very controlled in most cases. So that really surprised me. And then I said, okay, fine, if this research is out there, people must be doing something about it. And then I found another number that sort of scared me, which was that even with all of this information out there, there are more children's products that have animals as the main characters than all of the visible minorities combined. And so that just really shook me. And I was wondering why, when there is information that says that this is important, there weren't enough products or media available for kids. Because again, since it's a sheltered group of kids, it's either people they're exposed to or the media that they're exposed to that is helping them form these biases. And so I realized that if you're not actively participating in conversations with them, they're passively absorbing this information from around them, whether you realize it or not. And so a great way to sort of help with that is, of course, finding products which can address that, just very easily change the illustrations, and very subtly bring in the concepts for kids, right? They're kids that young, 7 years and younger, very open-minded, very open-hearted. They don't need a lot. They don't need to be pushed in any particular way to think about it. If they just see illustrations of different things, their imagination takes over from there. So it's actually very easy. And there is research that shows if you have inclusive messaging, these biased attitudes can change in just a few weeks. So it's not a lot of work that needs to be done. And that's where Little Pataka is trying to find space and create those products that do that. And, it's not about reinventing the wheels with the products. What we do, it's like jigsaw puzzles, mix and match games. It's stuff that already exists, but what we're doing is changing the illustrations on them, because that's all that they need. And so that's what Little Pataka is trying to do.
This is also taking me back to something that you brought up, Anisha, when you were talking about your work, about young people in your practice that you see who are navigating their physical and cultural identity. Years ago, my children went through food allergy testing. And of course, that extensive questionnaire includes things like, were your grandparents ever, allergic to peanuts or fish and things like that? And so we all have this genetic coding that we inherit from all of our grandparents and great-grandparents. And oftentimes we don't feel like we can have those conversations. Oftentimes they've passed away, right? And there are stories that they have not, about their life experiences that they have not exposed us to. We often hear about, that uncle of our grandmother who never got married and lived alone with his many dogs and his best friend. So, there are all of these these characters in our lives that we have not actually explored with our parents. Anisha, do you see, when you are meeting patients, tell us about some of these complex family relationships that sort of blossom when you are treating a patient who is coming to terms with their physical and cultural identity?
Well, I think you're just tapping into the beauty of sharing one's personal story. And I think that is such an important part of really exploring anyone's identity, but also thinking about one's own cultural roots and heritage. And so much of what we do as pediatricians, but certainly as providers and anyone, is talking about, tell me a little bit more about you and what is your story, and tell me a little bit about, who else is around you, like who is your family, where do they come from, what religion is being practiced, what are the foods, what's the language. And I train, all of the medical students and residents that I work with to really explore that, because that is such a rich way to really understand the context of what a young person is going through, but certainly some of the biases or stigma and other things that they may experience. And I'll just share one other thing, which I didn't mention earlier, but I'm actually the co-producer of a movie called One Small Visit. And it's a movie that actually was on a short list for the Oscars 2 years ago. It's been screened all over the world. But this movie really is actually about my parents meeting Neil Armstrong in 1969. And the fact that Neil Armstrong happened to open up his door, my parents met him and kind of went from there. And I just say this because this story really helped me to learn so much about my own parents and their immigrant experience, and what it was like at that time to go into a Midwest town and knock on someone's door wearing saris and so much. And so storytelling is such a powerful thing that I think all of us as parents and caregivers need to share with our kids about our own experiences and what's happened, much less, again, when we're working with young people, getting them to also talk about what their personal stories are. And I'll just mention one other thing in my work around the world, and certainly in putting together Raising Global Teens. Many young people told me that no one ever had asked them about what it meant to define their culture, and certainly who they were and where they felt like they fit in. And I can say, when I was growing up as an Indian American, there was no one else like me. I was the first one that graduated from my high school in Delaware. And it wasn't until I went off to university that I saw other people that looked like me. And so asking young people, who do you feel, what is your identity? Where do you feel like you connect? How can we support you with that is really important. And many times as parents and caregivers, we assume we're having those conversations, but we actually don't really have those discussions to really understand where kids are with that. So again, a lot of information. Coming back to your point of the importance of sharing stories and personal stories, and how rich that can be in terms of understanding our genetic history, but much more about our culture and everything else that defines us.
Yeah, that's a beautiful interweaving. And Aruna, this is something that Desi Rainbow supports families with, right? With dispelling some of the barriers that we feel around creating our own stories. I really like what you said there, Anisha, about just knocking on the door. Aruna, you're probably helping many families open that door once their queer child has knocked on it. How do you advise, how do you help families navigate these spaces, these conversations that overlap physical and cultural identity?
Yeah, see, our focus really is the bottom line is what is in your child's best interest. And many times, parents come to us, we're carrying, as I mentioned before, all this shame, all this, longing for like normalcy, longing for like a different scenario. And we come in with questions that we think are supposed to be helping our child, but really what they're doing is trying to reinforce our sense of what we want for them. So a lot of our work with families really is just exploring where they are with their understanding of gender and sexuality, whatever their child's identity may be, and then focusing on not necessarily changing their mind. Sometimes like changing your mind is very, very hard, but changing your behavior. So, how do you act towards your child? How do you take action in your daily life to ensure that your child is feeling supported, is feeling seen, is feeling heard? So we don't all have to become, people waving pride flags in parades, but we have to be somebody in our child's life who they can feel safe with and who they can express who they are to without feeling like, essentially excluded, rejected, hurt. So that's one really big piece of what we do. And one of the things that really is so important to me, because I myself had to take my journey alone when my kid was young, there was no community support. I think just having this sense of not having to go to your child all the time for questions is really important, because we constantly cross-question our children. It's like, so what made you this way? How did you become this way? What happened to you? none of which is relevant, and none of which your child really like wants to speak to you about. Your child just wants that support, right? So we focus on talking to your peers, talking to other parents like me, like, other folks who look like us, came from where we came from, and using your peers as a source of education and support. So I think that's really like one of the key things that we do. You have to talk to somebody who's walked in your shoes, to genuinely understand what this feels like. And that's what we offer, that sense of cultural support, of understanding a shared experience. And I really like what Anisha said about storytelling. And I think one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot, we always assume our children are pioneers, right? I keep telling everybody, my child is the only out queer and trans person in our family. And that's true, because he's the only out queer and trans person in our family. What happened to all those ancestors? What happened to all the people who came before, who have always existed? But we don't have those stories. So I think to excavate those stories from our culture, from our families, is really, really important.
Yeah. And Ekta, in your role, you're obviously at a university, and that's the majority of the young people you interact with. And here you have people on the other side of that door, right? So Aruna is preparing the families how to open that door. How do you, in your work with students and undergrads, how do you prepare them to make that very bold and brave step of talking to their families about not just their sexual identity, but who they are? They may want to change from med school to study art. How do you help them navigate these things?
Definitely had many of those conversations. I think it's a lot of it first is sometimes helping them, explore more about themselves. And a big part is differentiating how much am I wanting to do this, or because of what I've been told I should be doing? Will I be worthy? Will I still be seen as successful if I choose this different path? And I do think that a big part of it I talk about with my clients a lot is, you know, how can you break that barrier with parents, especially sometimes when in the relationship there hasn't been that kind of dialogue. There hasn't been that conversation, like, everyone is mentioning of like, who are you? What do you want to do?
Mhm.
It's more like, this is what we want for you. And, we really want the best life for you. But that idea of what that life is very different. The biggest barrier when I talk to students about this of like our families are, and chosen families are critical in providing support, is they say, my parents, they don't talk about emotions. They can't. That is their limitation. And so, a big part of it, I try to remind them in those moments is, just the way you are evolving as a person, like, so are they. They are also consistently changed. They're not static parents. They're also evolving. And how can you start that? And once you start, that changes the dynamic. And it's inevitably going to shift, your relationship now as an adult, with them. And I do thankfully get to work with some parents too in my private practice, and some of the work I've done with They See Rainbow too. So it's exciting doing it on both ends.
And I can see, sort of a thread of questions in the chat room. People also want to know about children who are presenting with neurodivergent disorders. Oftentimes when your child is one of the few Indian children at a school, it's just assumed, oh, you must be so good at math. And when our children struggle with subject matter, because maybe they are autism spectrum, or many, or dyslexic. So, that's something that I think, Akshata, in your work, when you're creating toys and books, you have to think about all of these divergent ways in which children's intelligence develops. So can you tell us, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it takes a lot of conversations with, people who work with kids, who have these, who are neurodivergent. And so they do need stuff addressed in a particular way, or the type of font, like you said, dyslexia. There are special fonts that are used for kids who are dyslexic so that reading becomes a little easier for them. I've had counselors tell me that sometimes, when they look at the affirmation card cards that we offer, they're very detailed illustrations. And so I've had counselors tell me that they won't be able to carry it for certain, some of the kids that come in because they prefer like faceless cards or something. It's easier for them to use that to express rather than a very detailed illustration. So it's about meeting with the people who work with the children to make sure we understand what is needed for them and then creating something based on it. But it's important to work with experts because, as I said, I'm a biochemist and nutritionist, so it's not, I'm not a psychologist or an early childhood educator. So these are not my areas of expertise. What I am good at is coming up with product concepts based on the expert advice that I've received. And so that's what we do. But there is a lot of research available now that can help address these conditions, which were not available before. So I think it's a good place to be in to try and find things that can help your child early on, because the sooner you start, the better it can be for them. I also want to add one point to what Anisha had said about, your own identities and how, you have to feel where you are. And I think we have to, as parents, also realize that for the longest time, having moved from India to here now 20 years ago, but I always felt too Indian in America and too American in India. And so to try and find like the right spot of who I am and what I'm holding, that it's not two separate things, but if I weave them together, that's how it'll be. And I think I learned that when Ava was born, and I saw how she was eating like dosa with a chutney that had maple syrup in it that she had mixed in. And so I was like, here's a beautiful example of a South Indian kid eating Vermont maple syrup mixed in with chutney, right? And so I remember that so vividly, and that helped me realize I needed to blend those things. And if I knew who I was with those two identities, I could then be a better parent to her as well. And so that is also something that informs the way that we create products, is that you work with others and bring those pieces together. There are intersectional identities for pretty much all of us. And so if we can understand that and create things that fit that rather than individual things, I think that's better.
And this notion of otherness, or like feeling that you have to pick one identity, we know that this came up very recently in the political sphere. And honestly, with the rise of Kamala Harris in the political arena, all of us are experiencing a bright spotlight on our Indianness. Our children, their friends, and their families are suddenly hyper aware of our Indian identity. Ekta, how do you suggest navigating this? Have you seen this come up recently in your undergrads and the people you interact with?
As far as them kind of thinking about their identity and their cultural identity?
Well, most specifically about the Indian part of it, being Indian in America. And of course, we know there was all this controversy about, well, she only recently became Black. And, these are things that we know we've had to deal with. But how do you, in your professional setting, help young people navigate this?
Yeah, I do think this is a big part of the work I do, is especially with South Asian individuals, is looking at their identity, to points that have been made. Some are third culture kids who've been brought up everywhere, or when they're in, different spaces, they're not Indian enough. And in other spaces, they're not white. And so they're feeling like they don't fit in. And our kids are bicultural, multicultural, kind of growing up here. So I do think it is a huge part of the work that we do, is how can they look at these great values. And I've also worked with many students who sometimes push away from their Indian identity because it comes along with many of the patriarchal or heterosexist values that they are trying to push against. So I do think a big part of it is helping them look at what are these beautiful parts of your culture that we can hold and keep close, and what are other parts of the many identities you hold, and let's also bring those up and hold those tight. So it's not just having to pick and choose, kind of like people are trying to do with, Kamala Harris right now as well.
Yeah. And there's another excellent question in the chat room, and that's more about how have all of us on this call helped our families to pass along the richness of the culture, the languages, while raising our children, while forming our own identities in this country. I'm going to ask you, Akshata, because I think you're at the very first building block of that with the products that you're launching through this through Little Pataka.
Yeah, and I think that, it's something it it honestly depends on what your definition is of success in that situation. You want to give yourself some flexibility because it's not going to be like growing up where in India where you were immersed in that all the time. So whether you wanted it or not, you absorbed it. It is going to take more effort. It is going to take more work on your part to make it happen. You have to accept that. You have to also accept that it may not work out as perfectly as you want it to. As I've had to tell some of my family members, yes, Eva does speak some Konkani. She does have an accent to it, and I'm okay with that. Like she doesn't have to have no accent. I don't know why that matters. But I think you have to change your own expectations of what it is that you're trying to pass on. What is our culture? Our culture is love. Our culture is respect. Our culture, that's the part of the culture that we need to pass on. Languages, yes. What I can tell you is that the kids that I work with mostly, they're sponges at that point. Anything you put around them, they're just going. And so the more, you can have bilingual books, you can have, phone conversations where they're speaking to family in that particular language that you're interested that they learn about. Those are types of things that you can do, but you have to make effort to it. I started Little Pataka so that my daughter would learn Konkani, which is my native language. There are no written Konkani books for young kids because until recently it didn't have a script of its own. So I created the first one, Planet Patrado, for her. Like that's the reason the whole brand exists. And so, I launched a business to teach my daughter the language I wanted her to learn. But as I was doing all of that, I also realized what I said. What is the part of me, my family, and my culture I want her to take forward? And that is love, it's respect, it's hard work, it's, persistence, it's jugaad to some extent, right? It's those things that make us Indian, really. And that's what I've started focusing on more. The language and stuff she gets as she hears all of us speak it, and we do our best to speak it as often as we can around her, and now my son as well.
Could I also?
I was just going to ask you, Anisha, in a clinical setting, why don't you jump in?
Sure. And I was just adding from a personal standpoint, my husband is German. Obviously, I'm Indian American, and we lived in Hong Kong and the Netherlands and have just come back very recently. So I'd like to say that my kids think of themselves as global citizens. And isn't that what we want all of our children and young adults to be, as people of the world that have passion and tolerance and are thinking openly about everyone else around them? I mean, that's really what we hope as parents. I want to come back to the language piece. When I grew up, my parents are from Kerala and they spoke Malayalam to me, but there were not many other Malayalis growing up. So I always understood it, but never spoke it very well. And as a result, as a parent, I felt very strongly that my own kids be able to speak language. And I'll just say from a medical standpoint, your ability to learn language is probably at its highest as you're a child and an adolescent. Mm-hmm. And it's not as easy for those of you that are adults that have tried to learn languages as you get older. So mm-hmm. There's some benefit to really insisting on that immersion and not only hearing it, but speaking it back. And so very mm-hmm. Just in Germany, because my boys are learning German, are fairly fluent, but have learned several other languages from living around the world. So language is really important, but being involved in extracurricular activities that also kind of build on that. I was a classical Indian dancer for most of my life, and that for me gave me a lot of joy in terms of my heritage, but certainly, what are those activities that we can give our kids that will also mm-hmm. help them to appreciate their own culture? And certainly they're going to take on some elements and others not, and kids temperamentally are different. One child will identify very heavily, the other won't. So just being aware of that, I think, are my other thoughts. But as much as we can expose through travel and experiences, that is a really beautiful thing.
I think what everybody has been bringing up is this whole sense of you have to look at this this person who is this young growing person in your family as an individual. And I'm the mother of 2 sets of twins. So the concept of individuality is one that I'm constantly navigating my older sons are very physically different from each other, and that's always been an easier thing for us to navigate. But my younger boys, they may be identical. I don't know. I've never had them tested, but they look very, very similar. All of their friends' parents can't tell them apart, but their friends can tell them apart. And the sense of individuality, even the two of them, they refer to themselves in conversation as us. Even if I say, what would you like to have for dinner tonight? And one of them will say, well, we want to have this. So there's so much in just, the language of how you acknowledge them on a day-to-day basis. We all have children of different, different stripes. Some of our kids are queer, some are young, some are infants, and some are off to, out in the world in their late 20s. There's an aspect to this conversation that I think it would behoove us to touch on a little bit, as we've been talking about sort of raising essentially Desi kids. But as many of us on this call, we have actually intermarried into, different ethnicities. And Anisha, you and Akshata, you're raising actually mixed race children in America. Is that a different level of complexity? How do you handle that, Anisha?
I think you handle it with grace. You, culturally, my husband and I are very different. I made him watch my big fat Greek wedding when we got married because, our families are so different. But, accepting those differences, having conversations, understanding where there might be differences, trying to bring your parenting styles and philosophies together. I think of it, and we're learning every day. I'm always humbled by my own teenagers and what they teach me. So I think the short answer is, continuing to also build a village, I think, is my other recommendation. You're not doing this on your own. And, making sure that my parents are very much involved. So are, my husband's family, but making sure that you have this community wherever you are that can support you. And sometimes your own children may not want to come to you, but being able to identify one or two other adults and having that ability to connect with them is such an important part of their growing up. So I think they always say it takes a village. And I think creating that village and creating that support for your child as they're growing, particularly if they're multicultural, is really important.
So, Aruna, here's a question that I think would be perfectly suited to you. What are your thoughts on how we can help expand the worldview of adults who have not had an opportunity to think about some of these things before? And after you, Ekta, I think I would love to hear from you on that same question.
Yeah, so I'm thinking essentially the idea of looking at the world in a way that essentially expands your horizons is really important for us as parents and as people, in this world at this point. Because essentially, if you're going to be sort of so insular that we only take what we have learned as children or perhaps has been taught to us, we're missing out on this huge range of opportunities. I mean, I think one of the joys of immigrant life is this sense of just being, part of this grand world that you didn't even envision when you were a child. So I think that's really important, that sense of curiosity, that sense of wanting to explore. I think one of the things that people do is they get scared by differences that essentially might make them feel inadequate, or that they feel essentially might be frightening to them in some fashion or threatening to them. And the best way to deal with those things is to essentially educate yourself, talk to people who are perhaps reflect that identity, or reflect some of that information, and really teach your children that it's okay to ask questions. I think we always fear asking questions because we don't want to look ignorant, or we don't want to feel ignorant. And that's one of the things that, for instance, frequently happens to me, right? I mean, people will be like, I want to be an ally, but I feel really I might say the wrong thing, or I might do something that's going to be offensive to somebody. And the point is essentially, as long as you ask questions with respect, and you ask things with the intention of learning, not of informing people what you think of them, I think that really will give you the opportunity to expand your own horizons. I have to say that I got into this work of LGBTQI rights and advocacy as a middle-aged woman. I did this, of course, out of my own need, right? Because I needed to find community for myself when I didn't, feel supported. But being immersed in the LGBTQIA world has completely transformed my own personal life, my personal experience, built me a chosen family. So much of like what we do is like essentially, we assume that we are restricted to our kin, right? And who are our kin? It's not just necessarily people who are related to you by blood. It's those of you who are going to like uplift you, give you like what you need as an adult to like move forward in your life. So I think I'm a living testimonial to opening and expanding your horizons, and being an auntie to so many LGBTQ kids now is like, really the center of my life.
Ekta, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I really, agree with what you mentioned, Arna, and maybe I'll take this question kind of in a little bit of a different space of kind of that intergenerational gap that is sometimes there, and how it can be different, kind of bridging that and the different worldviews, and I think about this with. I shared in the chat, my brother is gay, and he has I have a biracial niece, which she's beautiful and amazing. And my daughter has a skin difference. So her skin is very different than most folks. She has a large nevus on her body. And so these have led to so many, sometimes really challenging conversations, with our nani, nanu, dadi, and dadu, of sometimes wanting, even just with when we think about body differences and physical differences, of sometimes, encouraging to cover her up. And, I think sometimes when there is that personal connection to some of this, we've had a lot of conversations with our family of we're never going to raise our daughter in a place where she's going to hide her skin or her body, and even with one of the books we bought my daughter, and which I put in here is, what makes a family and how to make a baby. And it talks about how you make a baby. There's someone who has an egg and a sperm and a uterus, and that's how families are made. It's not about a mommy and a daddy. And so it's it was obviously uncomfortable the first time my daughter, my 3-year-old, asked her nanu, does he have a uterus? And she was like, oh no, you have sperm. And that was really confusing for him, of having a 3-year-old use these words with him. But for us, that's been so important. And even having to, yeah, also kind of sometimes go against the common diet culture discussions that are happening, in our families, of like, I've got to lose weight to get into the sari for the wedding, and having to talk to parents about, hey, that is not how I want to talk to our daughter and my son about their bodies. So I do think it's almost continuing to have those difficult conversations, but also how it then impacts our children, right? Those things that have seemed so innocuous and common, how we have to challenge those.
There is a comment in the chat that I think we should surface here, and that because I love bringing in ideas that maybe are running at a different tangent to what we're talking about. So we have somebody who said that they think is a controversial comment, though I actually think this is very grounding our conversation. They say, I think hanging on to this concept of identity seems a bit problematic since it builds the ego. Philosophically and spiritually speaking, dissolving the ego is what frees one up and enables us to be content. And I could also expand that to say dissolving the ego frees us up to be free. But Ekta, back to you, the psychologist. What do you think of this concept? Do you think they're onto something? How do you navigate that question?
And I'm rereading it in the chat as well. I think it's important,
Yeah.
And I think we have to think about this from multiple ways, right? If we're only consistently just talking about personal identity, we lose a big part of our collectivistic and beautiful culture, the village, like as you were referring to, Anisha, right? So I agree. I think when it becomes one-sided and we're just talking about individualism and just themselves, of course, we're not setting our kids up for success. So it is having more of that holistic conversation, but I appreciate bringing that point up so we can kind of zoom out a little bit as we're having this conversation.
Yes, I think we are obviously existing in a society that is, a rich migrant culture that is the fabric of America, and we are trying to find our own strand, our own thread. And really, I keep going back to that Indiaspora study that examines the different areas of impact that Indians have had in America. And this is just, we're just scratching the surface, going back to a previous thread of our conversation about intergenerational, how do we form a pathway for the next generation? I think Indiaspora is actually doing a lot of work in finding new models, new ways. I know there are lots of pilots underway right now of finding new models for what we're calling the next gen. How do we either do immersion programs in India or build networks here in the United States? And then modeling from there out to places like Australia, UAE, Canada, and of course, Europe. So I'm very excited about all of the work that's taking place at Indiaspora and this really organic group of folks. I was turned on to it by a friend. Again, this is a demonstration of the village at work. And I've been very attracted to the mission and to the work that this organization, I mean, it's not really an organization, it's just us that we're engaged in. And we're also lifting each other up. So this is very important. Just here on this call, we have, just look at us. We're all physically different. And we come from very different experiences of when we first arrived in America. And we've just got 5 minutes left. And I'm going to ask each of you to summarize, give us something to hold on to as we leave this call in 5 minutes. So just take a couple of seconds. I'm going to tee you up first, Anisha, with what are a few things that you would like the people on this call to take away?
I would just start with the idea of building on unique strengths. And so much of my work with children and adolescents is knowing that we are all uneven. We're going to be good at some things and we're going to have a hard time with others. But each one of us have some quality or some ability that's unique to us that we do well in, whether it's the arts or music or sports or anything like that. And of course, we're watching the Olympics right now, and we see some folks who really, very have unique strengths when it comes to athletics. But again, I come back to that because as parents and caregivers, being able to identify what that unique strength or strengths are in your child is such a beautiful thing. Continuing to build on that actually creates a lot of self-confidence and self-esteem. And self-esteem and self-confidence, I'm sure Ekta can add to this, a lot of times is built by the time you are 9 or 10 or 11 years of age. And having self-esteem and self-confidence is so protective when you are then experiencing those factors, whether that again now is substance use or other issues related to sexuality or any of these other things that sometimes young people also are going to experience as they get older. So again, I think what I'd love to leave everyone with is this idea of how do we go back and have those conversations with our kids that are nurturing and supportive and build on the things that they do well. They may not be doing all the things that we want them to. We have so many expectations, but every single one of us and our kids have something that's unique, and building on that is a wonderful way to again, foster self-confidence and to support them as they go on into adulthood.
Akshata, can you please go next and leave us with a few thoughts that you'd like us to take away?
Absolutely. I agree with Anisha about, self-confidence, self-esteem, as I'd mentioned, confidence and empathy. Those are the two important leadership qualities. So I completely agree with her. I would say, and this is something that I'm learning for myself, is that there is no perfection when it comes to all of this. If there are complicated conversations that you think you need to have, your parenting style, skills, whatever it may be, it's not all or nothing. There's no perfection. Your job is to just move it forward and be open to listening. That's the most important thing that you can do. Understand that you can ask questions, find people where you don't have to be worried about getting canceled because you're asking questions, again, forming that community and the space where you can ask the questions and get the information because you're actually genuinely curious, and taking a break, and finding the space for yourself to get the answer before you have to share it with somebody. As a parent, sometimes we feel like we have to know the answer to every single question that our kids can ask us. And I think it's important. And it's funny to me that I'm saying this as a parent of only a 6-year-old child. So I don't like years ahead of me for where I have to keep learning this again and again. But take that break. If you don't know it, say it. Take the break, say you'll get back to them and get back to them. And that's perfectly fine. That's an important lesson for them as well, that, they can also get the right answer in their time and work on it rather than having to always know the perfect answer right then and there. So that's what I would say.
Aruna, what would you like to leave us with today?
So this has been such a kind of wide-ranging conversation. We've touched on so many aspects, and I think what I'm taking from it is that we worry a lot about passing on culture, passing on tradition to our children. As immigrants, we're so concerned about what is the next generation learning about these kind of big concepts that we think we need to pass on to them. I think, frankly, what children learn is from watching us do what we do. So whatever aspects of culture, whatever aspects of tradition that you want to pass on, they see what you do and they will like pick that up. And sometimes, yes, it's going to be beautiful things like learning dance or music. And sometimes it's just going to be like learning, how to make a bagarne, a tadka, sort of like essentially like learning simple things. I think the more important thing we need to focus on in parenting is building trust. I think without trust, this relationship between parent and child doesn't go very far. If it's built on fear and respect, those are things that I guess sometimes work in families. But really, without that trust, your child and you, essentially, you will fulfill your responsibilities by raising your child to a certain age and sending them off in the world. But if they don't trust you to be in their corner, regardless of whether they are, fit this definition of normal or success that you anticipate that they should, without that trust, this relationship won't last into adulthood. So I think really that's what we need to focus on, that they can speak to you about anything that they need to speak to you about, and that you listen to them and allow them that freedom to know that they can trust you with whatever they're telling you.
Thank you so much, Aruna. Ekta, you get the final word.
I wanted to kind of close on some of the comments in the chat too around mental health and, really thinking about how, mental health support can be a real asset and support for our families, as different and diverse as they are. And it's really critical finding providers who are multiculturally informed. And that doesn't mean that they're just desi. And, they can be the best therapist who really talks about the things we're talking about today and integrates that into assessment, whether it's around neurodivergence or, what someone's going through. But there are fantastic providers out there from all walks of life who could really help with doing some of this work and supporting our families, which is, I think, different than maybe, in the past with some of the stigma around mental health. But I guess for a parenting perspective, the last thing I'll say is just really being cognizant of the messages that, we're sending our kids about what's okay, what's not okay, what's, what makes them lovable and what doesn't make them lovable. I think a lot of times kids are picking up on these cues of what's okay, what makes them good, or in their parents' eyes, and it doesn't matter if they're 3 or if they're 18. They're kind of still looking for those signs and to push against their fear of it being a conditional love. So that's what I'll end with.
Well, thank you all so much. I just want to close out by sort of summarizing what we've all talked about today. We all have come to a shared understanding that really the best way to create these wonderful next generation humans that we are all raising is for our families to be a soft and safe space. Because if we're not, then what happens when something bounces against a hard space? It shatters. As well as we have to be places where our children can soften and round out their harsh, sharp edges. Because again, what happens when something sharp hits something hard? It shatters. And so can we create spheres that are going to have a soft landing? And that's what gives us a sense of having bounce. Anisha, I think that's a term that you introduced right at the top of this discussion. And hopefully we're all going to take away from today the different aspects of what it means to give our children the greatest gift, which is that can they have bounce? Mm-hmm. Amita and Shobha, I'd love to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Moira. Couldn't have closed on a better note. Thanks to each of you for treating us to a phenomenal conversation, educational. I know Akshita said maybe all the learning happens by age 5, but I think we all felt that we learned today with all of you on a On behalf of all of us at Indiaspora, fascinating conversation. Thanks. I know there have been a lot of comments. I know some of them will probably reach out to you privately also and have other conversations. I also wanted to quickly make a note that thanks to social media, I found out that today is World Allyship Day. I felt like we couldn't have chosen a better day to do this, and that was a beautiful coincidence. Look forward to having continued discussions like this. Thank you for being available for this chat. Thanks from
Bye,
all of us at
everyone.
Indiaspora. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.